Their Stories Foundation presents Descendants, interviews with second and third generation survivors. Today's guest is Macha Einbender. Hi, Masha. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Great. Can you tell us about your mom and dad and your family history?
Sure. So my mom is French, Jewish. She grew up during World War II. She was a year old during the war. Um, Her father and her grandfather were taken to Auschwitz, which obviously she doesn't remember much about that time because she was very young. But I just remember hearing the stories when I was younger. And my father grew up in New York, Lower East Side, and my parents were 22 years apart. So actually, when my mom was a baby, my dad was in Florence, Italy, fighting for World War II.
Wow.
He actually was one of the troopers that landed in Normandy as well.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so it's kind of
Yeah.
just yeah, really kind of crazy coincidence how
Yeah. It's the
but
full picture of World War II.
for sure, for
Yeah.
sure.
So
You know,
you're really second and third generation survivor.
yeah, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And do you know much about your grandparents?
I do. So my grandfather Isidore, he passed away when I was 5 years old. So I definitely have memories of him being with him. Because I used to go to France every summer and be with my grandparents up until I mean, 19 years old. I spent every summer with my grandma. And so when I was little, I remember going there. And my grandfather was just like this big teddy bear, generous, loving, kind. But I always just remember this deep sadness in his eyes.
Hmm.
Just remember that when I was little, and
Oh,
he was always sick. I felt like he was always in his pajamas a lot of times. He had developed bulimia after he was rescued by the Russians because they gave him too much food too fast. So his stomach never tolerated great
right.
amounts of food.
Oh,
So
wow.
he would eat and then he would throw up after.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's
And
something I remember. I just remember the sounds of him throwing up.
wow.
Yeah.
And do you know the story of how he got into Auschwitz?
Yes, so it's a pretty emotional story because he was going to flee with my grandmother and my mom. They were going to, I believe, Switzerland, and they had some money saved, and they saw the writing on the wall that things were getting pretty bad. They were in Marseille, so Marseille was one of the last places to really get hit in the south of France because the way that the Germans came in. So he was taken like late in terms of like war. I think it was like 1940, like just
44, probably.
probably 44.
Right.
So he was not in Auschwitz for very long. I mean, that's kind of a crazy thing to say. I mean, I think even one day in Auschwitz is too long, but
Yeah.
uh, he was there for, I believe, 9 months.
That's a long time. That's
It
a
is a
long.
long time, but compared to some people that were there for, you know, so long, and he was strong and he was able to survive, but they were going to leave and he was arrested. And the story goes that one of his friends he had asked for money. One of his friends borrowed money from him because he was that kind of guy. He just, he lent money to his friends and he kind of wanted to call in his debts so that this way he had enough money to travel and just clean up loose ends. And at the time, you were getting money for denouncing your Jewish friends.
Wow.
So, like, the police would come and say, "Do you know any? Where are the Jewish people? You have any Jewish friends that are around?" And you would get money for kind of telling the police where they were.
Yeah.
And so I don't think I'd like to believe that he didn't know this man what was going to happen. And he probably thought to himself, okay, well, this is a way for me to not have to pay him back, make a few, make a few bucks. And so
Yeah.
he turned my grandfather in.
Wow.
And yeah, he was actually tried years later in the Nuremberg trials.
Wow.
And they were going to make an example out of him. And, and they said that he was going to go to jail or sentenced to death. I don't know what the sentencing was, but they actually overturned it. And a couple of days later, he was walking down the street and got hit by a truck.
Oh my gosh.
Can't make this stuff up, right?
Story.
Yeah.
And what about your grandmother?
So my grandmother was very young during the war. I believe she was maybe 20 years old,
Right.
and young and pretty, and she had a lot of survival instincts, and her sole purpose was to make sure that my mom was okay. And this baby, they were being hidden in a farm somewhere, like in the you know in in the south of France.
Right.
She was working there, and my grandmother's mom was not like the women in my family were not Jewish. So my great grandmother had married a Jewish man, but he went to Auschwitz. Um, my great my grandmother was raised Catholic, basically.
Oh
She
wow.
married a Jewish man, Cohen, so he can't get more Jewish than that.
Wow.
So her mother was kind of hiding and taking care of her, and I know that during the when the Americans came in to rescue, there
Yeah.
was a bombing, and my grandmother's home was bombed. My great grandmother's home was bombed. I'm sorry,
Oh wow.
and her daughter died. So my great aunt passed away with,
Wow.
yeah. Just so there was a lot of different ways that the war affected my family.
Yeah. Yeah. It's coming
Yeah,
from different angles. It's
yeah,
amazing.
yeah. Hit from all sorts of different angles for sure.
And your mom, tell me about your mom.
So my mom obviously was a baby. And my grandfather came back, and I know that my grandfather did not speak of the war or the things that went on for a long time,
So
but
what year was your mother born?
43.
She was born in 43. Okay.
Yes.
And so
So
he was in hiding with your grandmother.
yes. And then my grandfather, when he came back from Auschwitz, he was obviously very sick, very thin, very traumatized. So my mom recalls, him just being uh, this frail man,
Mm,
but he didn't talk about the war at all. And
yeah.
then one day, people that had been in Auschwitz with him came to visit, and that's when he started opening up
Wow.
and then telling his story.
And how old, when was that about?
I think she was about maybe 4 years old, 5 years old when he
Okay.
started to speak. But all her entire childhood was him getting up in the middle of the night, screaming in the dark. Yes, like he couldn't sleep with the lights off. So if the lights went off by accident, he would start screaming. Obviously, the bulimia that affected him. You
So
know,
you witnessed some of that.
I did. I did. I remember that being young and just I remember him being in the bathroom and hearing that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is that so when did you first understand why he was doing that? Were you told the story? Do you remember when you
I
were?
remember being very fascinated from a very young age. I remember his tattoo. And I
Hmm.
just remember looking at that, and I remember like sitting on his lap. And then after he passed away, I had heard that he went away to concentration camp. I had heard my grandmother would tell me stories about the war. She was very vocal about it. And then I remember going to Hebrew school, and like in first grade and second grade, and I remember specifically a Hebrew school teacher telling us all about the showers,
Mm,
how our Jewish ancestors were given a little piece of soap, and they thought that they were going to get washed up and clean, and they were excited to wash the dirt off of them, and then they were in a gas chamber. And I just remember being deeply affected by all those stories
How
because
old were
obviously
how
I
old
think
were
I
you?
was about 7
Wow.
when I first started hearing, and then obviously became very obsessed with Anne Frank. I read a lot as a child.
Oh,
So I remember reading Anne Frank's diary maybe when I was 8 years old,
wow.
wanting to read everything that I could about.
How did it make you feel? Do you remember like
Oh, so traumatized,
feeling traumatized?
so scared. Yes, and for many years, I had fears of elevators. I had fears of being in a closed place. I had fear of any type of authority. So if we traveled a lot, obviously, because our family was in France, and I just remember just like immigration or police officers used to just scare the crap out of me. I mean, just anybody who had a uniform would scare me.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did you deal with it?
So I was obviously I was an anxious child. But I expressed myself a lot. They did send me to therapy.
Hmm.
And it wasn't until later on in life that I started healing a lot of this through what I discovered and what my mom now does, which is family constellation therapy. And that's what really started healing like the generational roots of it, and just understanding that the pain was not mine to carry, and that the best way for me to honor my grandfather, my great grandfather, or my Jewish heritage was to live in joy.
So obviously you saw that you witnessed trauma and you experienced trauma from witnessing it and from hearing the stories and from learning about the Holocaust. Do you think it was do you think trauma can be passed down, or do you think it was just your experience of learning about it, or do you think somehow how they were affected you?
I really believe that trauma is passed down generational. Like if you think about it, I was my grandmother when my mother was inside my grandmother, the eggs, and I really believe in all of that. Like when that I was you carry that, like I was inside or was already inside my mom's ovaries at the time when she was, a little girl.
Right,
So all the trauma that she felt, I felt.
right.
So of course, it didn't help that I learned so much on my own and was so fascinated by every movie I could get my hands on. I mean, I remember watching Sophie's Choice when I was little, and just yeah, I know it just the I did a number on myself for sure. But
That's a really difficult film to get through.
oh, terrible. I mean, I could still recall the scene I mean, it's just horrible. And but I think that it was because of this generational pain that I had inside of me that fascinated me and wanted to learn more, even though it was painful.
Mm. So did you continue throughout your life to read about and learn about the Holocaust?
Yes, always. Always.
You
Any
still.
movie, yeah, any movie that comes out that's Holocaust related,
Mm,
I watch.
wow. Do you think of yourself as a second generation survivor or third generation survivor, or like what how does it
I don't
categorize, can you categorize that at all?
I just think of myself as somebody who, because they survived, I was able to live. And I don't really consider myself a survivor. I don't really consider any of them a survivor. I consider them thrivers.
Mm,
And I believe that it was their strength and their will to live that helped them. Obviously, a lot of luck too that helped them survive what they went through.
right.
So I guess I don't really see myself as a survivor just because I wasn't there. And, but I guess I am in a sense.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept when second generation survivor, third generation survivor, because you're descended from survivors, so you wouldn't be here if they hadn't survived.
For sure.
Yeah.
Right. So grateful for that.
So as time goes on, we're losing our survivors.
Mhm.
And how important is it to continue to tell the stories?
It's so important because I think that when you tell the story, especially when I tell the stories to my children, these are stories that are part of our family and part of the fabric of who we are. And obviously I don't want them to be traumatized by it, but it is so important for them to know all of these different things that our family went through, and the resources that they had, and the fact that they have these amazing ancestors that were able to use these resources to live and to survive. Like, I remember my great grandfather knew multiple languages and he played chess very well. So he was able to survive by playing chess with the commanding officer in the
Mm,
camp,
wow.
because he wanted to be, and he found that my great grandfather, was a challenging opponent to play chess with.
Wow.
My grandfather was very quick, and he was 21 at the time, and he was able to understand the language very quickly, and help other people survive. So when they would call out the numbers in German, he would memorize all the numbers of people and say, that's you, and
Wow.
so those are the stories that I think are so important to tell my children, just so they understand that, in order to survive, you have to use your resources. You have to use your intelligence and whatever it takes. And my grandfather said that he had to forget that he had a wife, he had to forget that he had children, that he had a daughter, in order to, day by day survive.
Now, how sad is that?
I know, but it was the ones that were crying and that were longing and homesick. Those are the
Yeah.
ones that succumbed
Right.
more easily.
Right. I think I remember your mother talking about that.
Mm.
Wow. So, do you ever, I mean, so learning that you have studied the Holocaust and watched a lot of as many films as you can and read books ever since you were 7 years old. Can you ever make any sense out of the Holocaust? Does anything ever?
I can't. I mean, I can make sense of it. For a very long time, I never really understood how people just stood by and didn't do anything or didn't say anything. And but now I have a better understanding of how that happened. Maybe because we're living in a time where these things are repeating themselves a little bit, a
Mhm.
lot. Um, that people don't want to get involved. You're able to kind of justify certain things. Oh, it's happening to those people.
Yeah,
So I have a better understanding now as an adult of how these things could have happened, because before I had I couldn't understand, like, how were they able to pull people from their homes and take their belongings and ship them off? Like, where was anyone to, like, speak up?
yeah,
But now I understand how it's very easy to stay silent.
yeah. And to the other point, there was a lot of people who risked their lives to
Yes.
hide people and to help people on their journey to escape. And so you have both sides, but yeah, I think that fear and self-preservation made a lot of people just silent, you
And
know.
that's, it is something that I think about a lot, like, of when I see somebody suffering or when I see that somebody needs help, there's, that tendency. I mean, just something as small as my husband and I were driving yesterday and we saw an elderly woman, and she had, like, a lot of bags and, maybe like those recycled bottles, and she obviously looked very, just very, very old, very, like, she was doubled over and she was carrying these bags and she was dropping them. And we were driving, and my husband said, should we turn around and see if she needs some help or need a ride? And at first, your tendency is just to feel like it's fine, like let's just go. Like, we can't pull a U-turn, we're gonna get a ticket, But then something inside of me said, "Yeah, no, we have to go back."
Yeah.
So by the time we went back, she wasn't there anymore. But it is that feeling of, you have to be that person that says, "Yeah, I'll go back," or "Yes, I will stand up for that person," or
Yeah.
take care of it. So there's been a lot of different instances in my life where I will hear about somebody suffering, and I'll go the extra mile to do whatever it is that I can to help.
And do you think that's because of your family history?
For sure. For sure. I think that that's something inside of me that just feels like, you know, what if somebody could have helped them, or or the people that did help them.
Yeah.
Like, you have to recognize the helpers and
Yeah.
humanity. And when we lose our humanity, and when we just let people suffer, that's that's the worst thing ever.
So you touched a little bit on that. We're seeing anti-Semitism again today. Can you make any sense of anti-Semitism in the modern world and in, I mean, really World War II is not that long ago, so it is the modern world, but can you make any sense of anti-Semitism in general? It seems to keep popping up in strange ways and you know,
I mean, I guess I can make sense of it just because it's been around for so long. And I've read up a lot about, the root of it, the jealousy, or the way that um, the Jewish people have been just this scapegoat for years. And that's why I think it's so important for everyone to tell a new story, get to know people. It's what we don't know that keeps us blind,
fearful. Yeah.
fearful. So I think that the more that people communicate and talk about it and bring it out into the open, the more important it is. So I mean, I can't really make sense of it, but um, I know it exists, and
Did you
it's
ever experience it in your lifetime as, growing up?
I don't know. No, no, never. So I will say that I feel blessed but again, I grew up in Great Neck,
Right.
and I grew up in towns where I was the majority, not the minority.
Right.
So I never felt it.
Yeah. So that's just case in point of what you were just saying. Like, because you were in a community where Jewish people were thriving and everybody in the town, knew Jewish people and interacted with Jewish people, and it was the majority, you didn't feel it.
Right. I never felt it. I was blessed. I was lucky. Um but then again, you see the kids in colleges these days, and they're experiencing it. And um so I've been pretty sheltered from it.
Yeah, it's very sad. It's very sad to see people living in fear. We've interviewed a lot of survivors over the past year, and we hear from every single one of them that they're afraid again,
Mm.
and that's just terrible. you
It
know
is.
After what they went through, to be at this stage of their life at this age, to have that, it's really being re-traumatized again, by seeing it and feeling it. It's yeah, they're being re-traumatized. Do you think there's always a sense of fear, being Jewish? I mean, is that
I do. I think so. I think that when you're Jewish, you just have this. There is a part of you that's just like built in to know that, like, you can't be too careful. And we just came back from Abu Dhabi
Hmm.
and Middle East, and I remember I walked into JFK with my daughter and my mom, and I looked around, and we were getting on Qatar Airlines, and we were going on the line to check in. And I looked around and I was like, "Oh my God, like, uh, can I do this? Can I get on the plane with all these people that, supposedly hate us?
Right.
I that was my first reaction. And then I took a deep breath and just, but yeah, there's that sense of fear that, oh God,
Yeah.
maybe I shouldn't wear a Jewish star, which or I mean, my son, my 17-year-old son walks around with a big Jewish star.
Right.
There is a part of me sometimes that is definitely a little fearful.
Yeah.
Thank God he's 6'4" and big and hockey player, but it is a little daunting. And but then once I spent a couple of days in the Middle East, and everybody was so nice and it was so wonderful, and my daughter and I, even we found such peace and love in terms of like the Islamic religion and the call
And
for prayer.
that's
It's really
great.
cool. Yeah,
That's
it was beautiful and healing
that's
to
awesome.
be there. Yeah.
So tell me about your family, about your immediate family and what you do and the work you do with your mother, and tell us about that.
So I discovered years ago family constellation. I loved it. And actually, my first session that I did, I healed Holocaust trauma, which was crazy that that's what the field picked up. And I love family constellation so much. I introduced it to my mom. My mom traveled the world and studied with all the great ones. And now she does this, and it's amazing. Like just the amount of people and the amount of lives that she touches by helping them. And I think that that's just such a big contribution to be able to heal all these ancestral wounds. I mean, she works with so many German people too who have so much shame and guilt, and that's in their lineage.
Mm,
Uh, just a few weeks ago, we did a constellation, and there was a German woman there, and she broke down. She had so much shame and guilt in her system,
wow.
and thinking about her family and what they could have caused or what they could have done. So there's a lot of healing work that needs to be done there. So
Can you
I
explain
love,
can you explain the practice to us?
so basically family constellation is a healing modality. It's basically acting but with feelings. And you could do it one-on-one, and it's everything is about just finding out whether your pain or whatever it is that you're going through, is it generational, is it personal, and then healing it, bringing it to the surface. So in every family there's a system. You're born into a system, your mom, your dad, if you have siblings, and that's the first system that you're born into. And depending on what your family went through, it's in your roots basically. And a lot of times people develop symptoms of life, whether it be anxiety or whether it be a physical ailment, and no doctor can fix it. Nobody knows what it's from. And as a last resort, they'll go to do family constellation and find out that this is some pain that was back in somebody's in the generation, and they're able to heal it and work through.
Wow.
So, there's the field, which is like the space where you hold the constellation. When you have a facilitator who's very in touch with just her intuition, and who reads body language and different ways that people speak, or how they hold their body. You pick somebody to play your mom, you could pick someone to play your dad, and just this whole thing unfolds, and you're able to see things from a different perspective.
Wow.
And why it's so wonderful is that everything is about rewiring your brain. So if you have a belief system built in, like for years I had this belief system that like they could come and take me in the middle of the night from my home. Like that was a belief and a fear that I had. Somebody can come and take me from my home and take everything from me. Now obviously that's not something I was born with. That was not something that, like, it
You
wasn't a rational fear,
right.
right? But it was something that was obviously in my bloodline,
Right.
that people in my ancestry, they saw that happen. So it developed into a fear of mine. So I had to heal that, because if you don't, then you carry that around, and it doesn't belong to me.
Wow.
Not
So
real.
so interesting, based on your family history and that you and your mother both found this practice.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
It's it's amazing work. And so My daughter is 15, and she came to Abu Dhabi with us, and she's participated in a lot of the different things that my mom and I do. And I think she definitely has a knack for it and interest in it. And my 17-year-old son, man, my husband, like everybody understands the work that my mom and I do, and they've seen the results of it. They've seen people kind of break free right before their eyes
Wow.
of things that have been holding them back.
Do your kids, are they interested in the Holocaust and the story? They've been,
They are, but definitely not as fascinated as I was.
right, but they know the family story and,
They know the family story. They know that Mamish, which is what they call my mom, they know that she was a little girl during the war. They know that my grandfather fought during the war.
mm,
Uh, they know that their great grandfather was in Auschwitz, and so yes, they know all of that.
wow. So it hasn't really affected them too much, or do you think?
I'd like to think that the work that we did on ourselves, my mother and myself, like the way that we kind of healed that generational pain, so that they can just take the resources from that, not the pain.
Right.
Take the resources that your great grandfather was so smart. He knew how to play chess and speak languages, and that was something that made him survive.
Yeah.
So when you're able to take the resources from the pain of what your ancestors lived from, take those talents, and without the pain, it's a whole different story.
It's so interesting, and I'm really fascinated by that work that you guys do, and
Yeah, it's good stuff.
considering the history, which kind of leads me to the final question, and you've probably already answered a bit, but what would you say to future generations, um, based on your experiences as a second and third generation survivor?
So I would say that's so important to know the stories, to talk to your grandparents, and talk to your family members, and keep those stories alive. Because when we hide from the pain, or when we don't tell stories because it's too painful, or we don't tell stories because it's too shameful, and nobody wants to upset. Like, I remember for many years nobody wanted to talk to my grandfather about it, because obviously it was a very upsetting topic. But all those times that we shut down and we don't hear the stories, we're just burying the pain. It's still there. Stories still exist. So it's always better to bring those stories up to the surface, to the light. So my advice is, find out what went on in your past, whatever it may be. Find out what the stories are. Find out um, your motherland, where your family came from, who escaped what, how did they escape, who was left behind, did anybody pass away, did any, because all of those stories are so important, because they're woven into the fabric of who you are. So I think Americans in general, like, we're also like, oh, whatever, that's old stuff, we don't talk about it, we think about the present and the future. But it is so important to understand where you came from and your past, no matter how painful it is.
Absolutely, and hopefully we're helping that with this show.
For sure.
And I'm so grateful to have you as a guest, and I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Me
It's
too.
been
You so
very,
much.
very interesting. So Masha, thank you so much for appearing on Descendants, presented by Their Stories Foundation. And thanks again. It was great.
I appreciate it. I appreciate you. Thank you for doing this work.
Thank you.